The Untold Story of 9/11, Failure, Courage, and Consequences. September 11, 2001, began as an unusually calm and beautiful day on the east coast of the United States. The sun rose into a cloudless blue sky. Temperatures were mild, the air crisp, the kind of September day New Yorkers often look forward to after the haze of summer. In Lower Manhattan, the World Trade Center complex stood tall and commanding, its twin towers each 110 stories high forming one of the most recognizable skylines in the world. By 8 a.m., tens of thousands of workers were already at their desks in the towers, while others streamed in through the lobbies, coffee in hand, ready to begin another ordinary workday. Unseen to them, a plot nearly 5 years in the making was unfolding. 19 men, affiliated with Al-Qaeda, had been quietly preparing for this day. They lived in the U.S. for months, blending in as students and travelers, taking flying lessons at American flight schools, and studying aviation systems. Their mission: to turn passenger jets into missiles. That morning, they boarded 4 flights scheduled to travel from the East Coast to Los Angeles. Such flights were chosen because they carried large amounts of fuel for the long journey west. The planes would become their weapons. American Airlines Flight 11 left Boston Logan Airport at 7:59 a.m. bound for Los Angeles. On board, 81 passengers, 11 crew, and 5 hijackers led by Mohammed Atta. United Airlines Flight 175 departed Boston at 8:14 a.m., also bound for Los Angeles. It carried 56 passengers, 9 crew, and 5 hijackers. American Airlines Flight 77 took off from Washington Dulles at 8:20 a.m. with 58 passengers, 6 crew, and 5 hijackers. United Airlines Flight 93, delayed on the runway at Newark, departed at 8:42 a.m. carrying 37 passengers, 7 crew, and 4 hijackers. To airport staff and other passengers, the hijackers appeared unremarkable. They passed through security without raising alarms. In fact, several of them were flagged for extra screening, but at the time security rules only required checks for weapons in checked luggage, not in carry-on bags. Small blades and box cutters, the tools the hijackers carried, were allowed under FAA guidelines. This was the first of many systemic failures that would be examined in the aftermath. At 8:14 a.m., shortly after reaching cruising altitude, hijackers stormed the cockpit of American Airlines Flight 11. They stabbed 2 flight attendants and used mace to control passengers. Mohammed Atta, who had trained as a pilot, forced the crew out and took the controls. At 8:19 a.m., flight attendant Betty Young managed to contact American Airlines operations by airphone. "Calm but urgent," she reported, "the cockpit's not answering, someone's been stabbed in business class." Ong's call became the first direct evidence of a hijacking that morning. At 8:24 a.m., a chilling transmission was accidentally broadcast to air traffic control from the cockpit. Atta's voice came over the radio, "We have some planes. Just stay quiet and you'll be okay." Controllers, confused and alarmed, realized a hijacking was underway but had no protocols to respond. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, traveling at over 400 miles per hour, crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center between floors 93 and 99. The impact instantly killed everyone on board and hundreds within the tower. The crash created a massive fireball, scattering burning jet fuel through the upper floors. The impact zone trapped more than 1,000 people above the 93rd floor. Stairwells were severed, elevators destroyed. Those above had no way out. On the streets below, pedestrians froze in horror. Office workers, shopkeepers, and tourists looked upward to see flames and black smoke pouring from one of New York's tallest skyscrapers. For many, the first thought was accident, a plane gone off course, a terrible pilot error. News stations quickly broke into live coverage, cameras trained on the smoking tower. Within minutes, New York City's fire department and police department mobilized on an unprecedented scale. Fire companies raced downtown. Command posts were set up near the towers. Mayor Rudy Giuliani, in Midtown at the time, rushed toward Lower Manhattan. Inside the North Tower, thousands of workers began evacuating through darkened stairwells. Fire alarms blared. Public address systems gave inconsistent information. Many were told the building was secure and to stay at their desks, a tragic misjudgment. Still, thousands ignored instructions and fled. As the world watched live coverage of the burning North Tower, another plane approached the city. At 8:42 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 had also been hijacked. Passengers managed to place calls from the cabin, reporting stabbings and a takeover. They described hijackers armed with knives and claiming to have a bomb. At 9:03 a.m., just 17 minutes after the first impact, Flight 175 slammed into the South Tower between floors 77 and 85. The explosion created a fireball that erupted from multiple sides of the building. Millions of viewers saw the impact live on television. The second strike erased all doubt. America was under attack. The South Tower's impact zone was lower than the North's, meaning fewer people were trapped above, yet those who were faced impossible conditions. Many stairwells were destroyed. Flames and smoke poured into hallways. Entire office floors became dark, suffocating chambers. In both towers, calls flooded 911 operators. Office workers begged for rescue from the upper floors, some describing unbearable heat, others whispering final goodbyes to loved ones. Fire dispatchers assured them that help was coming, though for many, help could not arrive in time. At 9:59 a.m., just 56 minutes after being struck, the South Tower gave way. The building collapsed from the impact zone downward, pancaking floor by floor in under 10 seconds. Thousands of tons of steel and concrete fell, releasing a thunderous roar. The streets of Lower Manhattan were engulfed in a rolling cloud of dust and debris. Survivors described total darkness, choking air, and a rain of papers, glass, and fragments of office life. Hundreds of firefighters and police officers inside the tower were killed instantly. Others outside were buried in rubble. The North Tower, burning since 8:46 a.m., held out longer, but its fate was inevitable. At 10:28 a.m., after 102 minutes of fire, the structure failed. The tower fell straight down in another massive collapse. With both towers gone, the World Trade Center complex was reduced to smoldering ruins. The skyline of New York City, once defined by the Twin Towers, was erased. In less than 2 hours, thousands of lives had been lost. Office workers, first responders, tourists, and airline passengers alike were caught in the destruction. The New York Fire Department would lose 343 firefighters that morning, the single largest loss of emergency responders in U.S. history. Survivors who escaped described stairwells packed with terrified workers, yet also with acts of quiet heroism, strangers carrying the injured, firefighters urging calm as they climbed toward danger, police officers guiding crowds to safety. On the ground, hospitals across the city prepared for mass casualties. Yet as hours passed, few survivors arrived. The scale of the tragedy became clear. Most who were in the towers when they fell did not survive. By the time the South Tower was struck at 9:03 a.m., the United States realized it was not witnessing a tragic accident but a coordinated assault. Television anchors, previously speculating about pilot error, now spoke of terrorism. Federal agencies scrambled to make sense of the unfolding chaos. Air traffic controllers across the East Coast searched their radars for other suspicious aircraft. Confusion reigned. Communication systems between the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, the military's Air Defense Network, NORAD, and other agencies were fragmented. Information was delayed, misinterpreted, or lost altogether. The nation's leaders were scattered. President George W. Bush was in Sarasota, Florida, visiting an elementary school. Vice President Dick Cheney was at the White House. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld was at the Pentagon. None of them yet knew the full scope of the crisis. American Airlines Flight 77, which had taken off from Washington Dulles at 8:20 a.m., was hijacked around 8:51 a.m. The hijackers stabbed passengers and crew before forcing their way into the cockpit. They turned the plane back toward Washington, D.C. Air traffic controllers lost radar contact with the flight at 8:56 a.m. when the transponder was switched off, a deliberate act by the hijackers to conceal their path. For more than half an hour, the aircraft roamed undetected. At 9:12 a.m., flight attendant Renee May called her mother from the plane, explaining that the aircraft had been hijacked. Other passengers managed to contact loved ones as well. They reported hijackers controlling the cabin with knives and claiming to have a bomb. At 9:37 a.m., Flight 77 crashed into the western side of the Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. military. Traveling at 530 miles per hour, the plane tore through 3 outer rings of the building. The impact and fireball killed all 64 on board and 125 military and civilian personnel inside. The Pentagon, symbol of America's defense, was now a target itself. Smoke rose from the building as firefighters and rescue workers rushed to evacuate survivors. Many office workers crawled through darkened hallways, choked by smoke, guiding each other to exits. The attack sent shockwaves through the nation's capital. The heart of American military power had been breached. At 8:42 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93 had taken off from Newark, New Jersey, bound for San Francisco. Its departure had been delayed by 42 minutes due to runway traffic. That delay would prove crucial. At 9:28 a.m., hijackers stormed the cockpit. Air traffic control recorded sounds of screaming and violent struggle over the radio. The plane abruptly changed course, turning eastward back toward Washington. Passengers on Flight 93, unlike those on earlier flights, had time to learn what was happening elsewhere. Using earphones and cell phones, they spoke to loved ones who told them about the attacks on the Twin Towers. Realizing their plane was part of the same plot, they decided to act. Among the passengers was Todd Beamer, who spoke with a phone operator on the ground. Calmly, he described the situation and the plan forming among passengers. Before hanging up, he was heard saying the now famous words, "Let's roll." At around 9:57 a.m., passengers and crew launched their counterattack. Using makeshift weapons, hot water, fire extinguishers, and whatever they could grab, they rushed the cockpit. Hijackers rocked the plane violently up and down, side to side, in an effort to throw them off. At 10:03 a.m., United 93 crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, at nearly 580 miles per hour. Everyone aboard was killed. Investigators later concluded that the hijackers intended to strike either the White House or the U.S. Capitol. The passengers' actions prevented that outcome, making Flight 93 a symbol of courage and resistance. In Washington, D.C., confusion and fear spread quickly. Evacuations were ordered at the White House, the Capitol, and federal offices. Thousands of workers poured into the streets, unsure of where to go. Rumors circulated of additional hijacked planes still in the sky. Vice President Cheney, escorted by Secret Service agents, was rushed to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, a secure bunker beneath the White House. From there, he coordinated with military commanders as the possibility of shooting down civilian planes was raised for the first time in U.S. history. The attacks exposed serious gaps in America's air defense system. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, had been designed to counter threats from abroad, not hijacked planes within U.S. borders. Radar systems were not well integrated, communication with the FAA was slow, and fighter jets were not stationed near major cities for rapid response. On the morning of September 11, fighters were eventually scrambled from bases in Massachusetts, Virginia, and elsewhere, but they were too far away, received late instructions, and in some cases flew out to sea because they were searching for non-existent threats. By the time Flight 77 hit the Pentagon and Flight 93 went down, no fighters had intercepted any of the hijacked planes. At 8:55 a.m., minutes after the second tower was struck, President Bush sat in a classroom in Sarasota as children read aloud. White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card whispered in his ear, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." Bush remained seated for several minutes, appearing calm as cameras recorded the moment. Critics later debated whether this was indecision or composure. After the reading, Bush addressed the school briefly, stating, "Today we've had a national tragedy." By 9:57 a.m., Air Force One departed Florida with Bush aboard. The plane climbed to 45,000 feet and was escorted by fighter jets, flying a circuitous route to secure locations. Bush would not return to Washington until later that evening, making stops at military bases in Louisiana and Nebraska. At 9:42 a.m., the FAA made an unprecedented decision. For the first time in U.S. history, all civilian aircraft were ordered to land immediately at the nearest airport. Within minutes, more than 4,500 planes across American airspace began descending. By early afternoon, the skies over the continental U.S. were virtually empty. International flights bound for the U.S. were diverted to Canada, which opened its airports in an operation known as Operation Yellow Ribbon. In towns like Gander, Newfoundland, entire communities rallied to house and feed thousands of stranded passengers. In New York, even as the towers fell, rescue efforts continued. Firefighters, police officers, and paramedics searched through smoldering rubble, pulling survivors from air pockets and collapsed stairwells. Ordinary civilians joined in, forming bucket brigades to move debris and water. At the Pentagon, survivors crawled out through shattered walls. Firefighters battled intense blazes fueled by jet fuel and office materials. Hundreds of injured were transported to nearby hospitals. In Pennsylvania, first responders and local residents rushed to the crash site of Flight 93. They found only smoldering wreckage, spread across a crater. The violent impact left few recognizable remains, underscoring the ferocity of the passengers' final struggle. By late morning, television networks around the globe carried live coverage of the attacks. Images of the burning towers, the collapsing skyline, the smoking Pentagon, and the field in Shanksville stunned viewers. Crowds gathered around public televisions, radios, and office screens. For many, disbelief gave way to grief. For others, anger rose. The sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. The most powerful nation in the world had been struck in its financial, military, and political centers in less than 2 hours. When the South Tower collapsed at 9:59 a.m. and the North Tower followed at 10:28 a.m., Lower Manhattan was plunged into a nightmare of dust and debris. A colossal gray cloud swept through the streets like a volcanic eruption, engulfing survivors, police, and firefighters. People stumbled blindly, covering their mouths with handkerchiefs, ties, or bare hands. Many thought the world was ending. For blocks around, daylight disappeared, replaced by choking darkness. Cars and emergency vehicles were buried under ash and fragments of metal and glass. Eyewitnesses described an eerie silence after the roar of the collapse, broken only by car alarms, sirens, and cries for help. The New York Fire Department, Police Department, and Port Authority police had mobilized on a scale never before seen. More than 2,000 firefighters and hundreds of police officers entered the towers after the first impact, climbing stairwells, helping evacuate civilians, and directing people to safety. When the buildings fell, 343 firefighters, 37 Port Authority officers, and 23 NYPD officers were killed. Many died trying to carry disabled civilians down stairwells. Others were last heard on radios giving calm directions moments before the towers collapsed above them. These losses devastated their departments. Firehouses across the city were left with empty bunks, silent radios, and grieving families. Remarkably, some people survived the collapses. A group of 14, known as the Stairwell B survivors, were inside the North Tower between the 22nd and 1st floors when the building came down. Trapped but alive, they were eventually pulled out by rescuers. Others emerged hours later, covered head to toe in dust, dazed but alive. Rescue workers dug through unstable piles of steel and concrete, listening for faint tapping or voices. Every discovery of life felt miraculous. But as hours turned to days, hope dimmed. By the end of September 11th, only a handful of survivors had been pulled from the wreckage. The destruction of the towers also wiped out New York City's Emergency Command Center, which had been located inside World Trade Center Building 7. Communications broke down. Fire and police units operated with different radio systems, preventing coordination. Many firefighters inside the towers never heard evacuation orders before the collapses. Mayor Rudy Giuliani established a temporary command post near the site. Covered in ash, he moved through the streets with staff, urging calm and telling reporters, "The number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear." Hospitals across the city prepared for thousands of wounded, but relatively few arrived. The realization set in, most who had been inside the towers did not survive. In Washington, government buildings stood emptied. The Pentagon burned. Fighter jets patrolled the skies. Rumors of additional hijacked planes persisted into the afternoon, spreading fear. At the Capitol and White House, staff evacuated quickly, leaving behind offices in disarray. Some lawmakers fled on foot into the streets. For hours, the seat of American government resembled a ghost town. Inside the White House bunker, Vice President Cheney coordinated with national security officials. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, after briefly helping with rescue efforts outside the Pentagon, returned to command military operations. By early afternoon, the FAA's unprecedented shutdown of American airspace was nearly complete. Airports were packed with stranded travelers. Thousands of international flights diverted to Canada, where communities welcomed unexpected guests. For the first time in history, the skies over the United States were eerily empty, patrolled only by military aircraft. The silence itself was a reminder of how quickly normal life had been upended. Even as smoke still rose from New York and Washington, intelligence officials began piecing together responsibility. Early suspicions focused on Al-Qaeda, the Islamist extremist network led by Osama bin Laden. Within hours, the CIA and FBI identified known associates among passenger manifests: Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shehi, Khalid al-Midhar, and others had been tracked in previous counterterrorism investigations. Some had attended flight schools. Several were known to have ties to extremist groups. But those warnings had never been fully acted upon. In the months and years before September 11, U.S. agencies had received fragmented intelligence pointing to a possible al-Qaeda plot involving hijackings. Yet bureaucratic barriers, interagency rivalry, and lack of urgency meant the dots were never connected. Later investigations revealed striking failures. CIA had tracked two hijackers, Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, to the United States in early 2000 but failed to alert the FBI. FBI agents in Minnesota had arrested Zacharias Moussaoui, a man training at a flight school, weeks before the attacks, suspecting he planned to hijack an aircraft. Requests to search his computer were denied due to legal hurdles. FAA rules allowed small blades, like the box cutters carried by hijackers, onto planes. NORAD and the military had no protocol for intercepting hijacked domestic aircraft. These failures did not cause the attacks, but they removed potential chances to disrupt the plot. The government, though aware of al-Qaeda's intent to strike, had underestimated its ability to do so on U.S. soil. At 8:30 p.m. on September 11, after returning to Washington, President George W. Bush addressed the nation from the Oval Office. His speech was brief but resolute. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. He vowed that those behind the attacks would be found and punished, and that terrorism would not triumph. The country, still in shock, looked to those words for reassurance. Around the world, governments and citizens reacted with horror and sympathy. Vigils were held in London, Paris, Berlin, Sydney, and countless other cities. NATO declared that the attacks on the United States would be treated as an attack on all members, invoking Article 5 for the first time in history. Even traditional U.S. adversaries expressed condolences. Russian President Vladimir Putin called for unity against terrorism. In Tehran, Iran, candlelight vigils were held by ordinary citizens. The global community recognized the enormity of what had occurred. That night, as fires still burned at Ground Zero, rescue workers labored under floodlights, moving twisted steel beams in concrete. Cranes and heavy equipment were brought in. Families of the missing gathered nearby, holding photos of loved ones, hoping for news. The site became both a rescue operation and a place of mourning. Workers described the smell of smoke, jet fuel, and burned material hanging in the air. For weeks to come, the ruins of the World Trade Center would smolder, a haunting reminder of the day's devastation. In the hours and days following September 11, Ground Zero became the focus of one of the largest rescue operations in American history. Thousands of firefighters, police officers, construction workers, and volunteers flooded Lower Manhattan, desperately searching for survivors in the tangled remains of the Twin Towers. They dug with bare hands, shovels, and heavy machinery. Dogs were brought in to sniff for signs of life. Families of the missing gathered at the site, clinging to hope. But hope faded quickly. Despite the massive effort, Only a handful of survivors were pulled from the rubble after the first 24 hours. The scale of destruction was simply too great. Within days, the mission shifted quietly from rescue to recovery. For families, that distinction was devastating. Across New York, posters and flyers covered walls, fences, and subway entrances, photographs of the missing, printed by desperate families with phone numbers scrawled below. People walked the streets handing out leaflets, asking strangers if they had seen their loved ones. Churches, synagogues, mosques, and community centers filled with mourners. Candlelight vigils were held nightly in Union Square and other neighborhoods. Grief was everywhere, but so was unity. Strangers comforted one another. Blood donation centers overflowed with volunteers. New Yorkers, though shattered, were determined to stand together. Even as rescue operations continued, federal investigators moved quickly to confirm who was responsible. By September 12, intelligence agencies were convinced the attacks were carried out by Al-Qaeda, the network founded by Osama bin Laden. The evidence was overwhelming. Passenger manifests matched names of known Al-Qaeda operatives. Intercepted communications from Al-Qaeda leaders hinted at a major operation. Recovered materials, including a flight manual left in Mohammed Atta's rental car, pointed to a coordinated plot. Bin Laden had long been on America's radar. In 1998, he had declared war on the United States, calling for attacks on U.S. citizens. His organization had already carried out the bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen in 2000. But 9/11 dwarfed anything before. It was an attack on U.S. soil, using America's own infrastructure against itself. The revelation that Al-Qaeda was behind the attacks prompted questions. How did this happen without warning? In August 2001, President Bush had received a classified memo titled "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S." It warned of possible hijackings, though without specific details. The CIA had monitored several of the hijackers overseas but failed to alert domestic law enforcement when they entered the U.S. The FBI had received reports from field agents about suspicious flight school students but had not pursued them aggressively. These lapses would later be investigated in detail by the 9/11 Commission. In the immediate aftermath, however, the focus remained on preventing further attacks. Across the United States, security tightened dramatically. Airports adopted new rules. Armed soldiers patrolled transportation hubs. Federal buildings were guarded by troops. In New York and Washington, anti-aircraft missiles were deployed. Citizens lived with anxiety. Rumors of new attacks spread constantly. Every unattended bag, every power outage, every loud noise triggered fear. The sense of invulnerability Americans once felt was gone. On September 14, President George W. Bush visited Ground Zero. Wearing a windbreaker and standing on a pile of rubble beside firefighters, he addressed rescue workers through a bullhorn. "I can hear you," he shouted, as they cheered. "The rest of the world hears you." And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon. The moment became iconic. It symbolized resilience and resolve. Many Americans, angry and grieving, found strength in those words. In Washington, officials quickly concluded that Al-Qaeda was operating under the protection of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. Intelligence confirmed that bin Laden and his followers maintained training camps there. Within days, the Bush administration began preparing for military action. The message to the Taliban was clear: hand over Osama bin Laden or face consequences. The Taliban refused. On September 20th, President Bush addressed a joint session of Congress in one of the most watched speeches in American history. He declared, "Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated." Congress responded with thunderous applause. A new era of U.S. foreign policy had begun. NATO formally invoked Article 5, the alliance's mutual defense clause. For the first time in history, an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. Allies pledged support for America's coming actions. Around the world, nations passed new anti-terrorism laws, tightened security, and froze assets linked to Al-Qaeda. Even countries historically at odds with the United States expressed solidarity. The financial impact of 9/11 was immediate. The New York Stock Exchange closed until September 17, its longest shutdown since the Great Depression. When trading resumed, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 684 points, its largest single-day drop at the time. Billions were lost in destroyed property, businesses, and disrupted industries. Airlines were hit particularly hard, requiring government bailouts to survive. Insurance companies faced record claims. Yet the U.S. economy, though shaken, endured. Many saw it as a sign of national resilience. By late September, it was clear that no more survivors would be found at Ground Zero. The site was officially declared a recovery operation. Workers shifted from rescue efforts to clearing debris, a process that would take nearly 9 months. Steel beams twisted by heat, crushed vehicles, and fragments of daily life were removed piece by piece. Fires smoldered beneath the ruins for weeks. The site became sacred ground. Workers paused regularly for moments of silence when human remains were found. Families came to lay flowers, pray, and grieve. The collapsed dust cloud. When the South Tower collapsed at 9:59 a.m. and the North Tower followed at 10:28 a.m., Lower Manhattan was plunged into a nightmare of dust and debris. A colossal gray cloud swept through the streets like a volcanic eruption, engulfing survivors, police, and firefighters. People stumbled blindly, covering their mouths with handkerchiefs, ties, or bare hands. Many thought the world was ending. For blocks around, daylight disappeared, replaced by choking darkness. Cars and emergency vehicles were buried under ashen fragments of metal and glass. Eyewitnesses described an eerie silence after the roar of the collapse, broken only by car alarms, sirens, and cries for help. The New York Fire Department, Police Department, and Port Authority Police had mobilized on a scale never before seen. More than 2,000 firefighters and hundreds of police officers entered the towers after the first impact, climbing stairwells, helping evacuate civilians, and directing people to safety. When the buildings fell, 343 firefighters, 37 Port Authority officers, and 23 NYPD officers were killed. Many died trying to carry disabled civilians down stairwells. Others were last heard on radios giving calm directions moments before the towers collapsed above them. These losses devastated their departments. Firehouses across the city were left with empty bunks, silent radios, and grieving families. Remarkably, some people survived the collapses. A group of 14, known as the Stairwell B survivors, were inside the North Tower between the 22nd and 1st floors when the building came down. Trapped but alive, they were eventually pulled out by rescuers. Others emerged hours later, covered head to toe in dust, dazed but alive. Rescue workers dug through unstable piles of steel and concrete, listening for faint tapping or voices. Every discovery of life felt miraculous. But as hours turned to days, hope dimmed. By the end of September 11th, only a handful of survivors had been pulled from the wreckage. The destruction of the towers also wiped out New York City's Emergency Command Center, which had been located inside World Trade Center Building 7. Communications broke down. Fire and police units operated with different radio systems, preventing coordination. Many firefighters inside the towers never heard evacuation orders before the collapses. Mayor Rudy Giuliani established a temporary command post near the site. Covered in ash, he moved through the streets with staff, urging calm and telling reporters, "The number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear." Hospitals across the city prepared for thousands of wounded, but relatively few arrived. The realization set in, most who had been inside the towers did not survive. In Washington, government buildings stood emptied. The Pentagon burned. Fighter jets patrolled the skies. Rumors of additional hijacked planes persisted into the afternoon, spreading fear. At the Capitol and White House, staff evacuated quickly, leaving behind offices in disarray. Some lawmakers fled on foot into the streets. For hours, the seat of American government resembled a ghost town. Inside the White House bunker, Vice President Cheney coordinated with national security officials. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, after briefly helping with rescue efforts outside the Pentagon, returned to command military operations. By early afternoon, the FAA's unprecedented shutdown of American airspace was nearly complete. Airports were packed with stranded travelers. Thousands of international flights diverted to Canada, where communities welcomed unexpected guests. For the first time in history, the skies over the United States were eerily empty, patrolled only by military aircraft. The silence itself was a reminder of how quickly normal life had been upended. Even as smoke still rose from New York and Washington, intelligence officials began piecing together responsibility. Early suspicions focused on Al-Qaeda, the Islamist extremist network led by Osama bin Laden. Within hours, the CIA and FBI identified known associates among passenger manifests. Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shehi, Khalid al-Midhar, and others had been tracked in previous counter-terrorism investigations. Some had attended flight schools. Several were known to have ties to extremist groups. But those warnings had never been fully acted upon. In the months and years before September 11, U.S. agencies had received fragmented intelligence pointing to a possible al-Qaeda plot involving hijackings. Yet bureaucratic barriers, interagency rivalry, and lack of urgency meant the dots were never connected. Later investigations revealed striking failures. CIA had tracked two hijackers, Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, to the United States in early 2000 but failed to alert the FBI. FBI agents in Minnesota had arrested Zacharias Moussaoui, a man training at a flight school, weeks before the attacks, suspecting he planned to hijack an aircraft. Requests to search his computer were denied due to legal hurdles. FAA rules allowed small blades, like the box cutters carried by hijackers, onto planes. NORAD and the military had no protocol for intercepting hijacked domestic aircraft. These failures did not cause the attacks, but they removed potential chances to disrupt the plot. The government, though aware of al-Qaeda's intent to strike, had underestimated its ability to do so on U.S. soil. At 8:30 p.m. on September 11, after returning to Washington, President George W. Bush addressed the nation from the Oval Office. His speech was brief but resolute. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. He vowed that those behind the attacks would be found and punished, and that terrorism would not triumph. The country, still in shock, looked to those words for reassurance. Around the world, governments and citizens reacted with horror and sympathy. Vigils were held in London, Paris, Berlin, Sydney, and countless other cities. NATO declared that the attacks on the United States would be treated as an attack on all members, invoking Article 5 for the first time in history. Even traditional U.S. adversaries expressed condolences. Russian President Vladimir Putin called for unity against terrorism. In Tehran, Iran, candlelight vigils were held by ordinary citizens. The global community recognized the enormity of what had occurred. That night, as fires still burned at Ground Zero, rescue workers labored under floodlights, moving twisted steel beams in concrete. Cranes and heavy equipment were brought in. Families of the missing gathered nearby, holding photos of loved ones, hoping for news. The site became both a rescue operation and a place of mourning. Workers described the smell of smoke, jet fuel, and burned material hanging in the air. For weeks to come, the ruins of the World Trade Center would smolder, a haunting reminder of the day's devastation. In the weeks after September 11, the United States moved from shock and mourning to military action. The attacks were not viewed as crimes by individuals, but as acts of war by an organized enemy. President George W. Bush framed the response in sweeping terms. America was entering a new kind of conflict, a war on terror. The immediate target was Afghanistan, where the Taliban regime sheltered Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda's leadership. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, the U.S. and coalition forces launched Operation Enduring Freedom. Airstrikes began against Taliban positions and al-Qaeda training camps. Special forces were deployed to support the Northern Alliance, a coalition of Afghan fighters opposed to Taliban rule. Within weeks, the Taliban's grip on Afghanistan began to collapse. By mid-November, Kabul fell. By December, most major cities were under coalition control. Bin Laden himself, however, managed to escape. At the Battle of Tora Bara, U.S. and Afghan forces cornered him in the mountains near the Pakistan border, but he slipped away, likely crossing into Pakistan. His escape would haunt U.S. policy for years. The war in Afghanistan was only the first step. President Bush made clear that the U.S. would not distinguish between terrorists and those who harbored them. Governments around the world were pressured to choose sides. Many nations supported the campaign. NATO invoked Article 5. Britain, Canada, Germany, Australia, and others sent troops. Even Russia and China, often rivals, expressed cooperation against terrorism. At the same time, the U.S. expanded counter-terrorism operations globally. Intelligence networks were strengthened, suspected operatives were arrested or detained, and financial channels linked to al-Qaeda were disrupted. While American forces fought abroad, sweeping changes were made at home. The sense of vulnerability exposed on September 11 demanded a complete overhaul of national security. Transportation security. The Aviation and Transportation Security Act of November 2001 created the Transportation Security Administration, TSA. Airport security, once handled by private contractors, became a federal responsibility. Screening became stricter, shoes removed, liquids restricted, carry-on limits imposed, and passengers subject to body scans. USA Patriot Act, signed into law on October 26, 2001, it expanded government surveillance powers, allowing agencies to monitor phone calls, emails, financial transactions, and library records. Supporters said it was essential to prevent future attacks. Critics warned it threatened civil liberties. Department of Homeland Security. In 2002, a massive government reorganization merged 22 federal agencies into one new department. Its mission, to prevent terrorist attacks, respond to emergencies, and protect the nation's infrastructure. These steps fundamentally changed daily life in America. Before September 11, air travel was casual and relatively relaxed. After, it became defined by long lines, intense checks, and a heightened awareness of risk. Another defining feature of the war on terror was the treatment of captured suspects. In early 2002, the U.S. began transferring detainees from Afghanistan and other locations to Guantanamo Bay, a naval base in Cuba. Officials argued the detainees were unlawful combatants who could be held indefinitely without trial. Many were suspected terrorists or Taliban fighters, but others were swept up with little evidence. Harsh interrogation methods, later classified as torture, sparked global outrage. Defenders said such measures were necessary to prevent new attacks. Opponents argued they undermined human rights and America's moral authority. The policies at Guantanamo became one of the most controversial legacies of 9/11. As the war progressed, investigations into how 9/11 happened continued. It became clear that the tragedy was not solely due to the skill of Al-Qaeda, but also to failures within U.S. government agencies. The CIA had tracked two of the hijackers overseas but never shared information with the FBI, who might have monitored them domestically. The FBI's Phoenix memo, warning about suspicious flight school activity, was ignored. The August 6, 2001 President's Daily Brief, warning of possible hijackings, had not spurred significant action. In 2004, the 9/11 Commission report documented these failures in detail. It concluded that the attacks were a result of a failure of imagination, policy, capabilities, and management across multiple levels of government. The report recommended sweeping intelligence reforms, leading to the creation of the position of Director of National Intelligence, intended to coordinate across agencies. By the end of 2001, America was transformed. The attacks had reshaped foreign policy, domestic security, and the national psyche. Airports, government buildings, and city skylines were forever different. Trust in safety was replaced by vigilance. For the first time in generations, Americans lived with the constant awareness of external threats. The phrase 9/11 entered the vocabulary as shorthand for national tragedy, global terrorism, and the day everything changed. Globally, 9/11 reshaped geopolitics. Many governments tightened security and passed anti-terror laws. Immigration and travel became more restricted. But the war on terror also had consequences. In some regions, U.S. policies fueled anti-American sentiment. In others, it strengthened alliances. The war in Afghanistan, initially widely supported, became prolonged and costly, stretching on for 2 decades. The attacks on September 11, 2001, had set the world on a new course, one defined by insecurity, counterterrorism, and military campaigns abroad. In the months after the attacks, the ruins of the World Trade Center became both a worksite and a sacred space. Recovery efforts lasted until May 2002. Workers removed more than 1.8 million tons of debris, often by hand, treating the site as hallowed ground. Every discovery of human remains was met with silence, flags lowered, and a respectful escort. Families gathered daily, some clinging to the hope of closure, others simply needing to be near the last place their loved ones were alive. As recovery ended, attention turned to the future. How should this place be rebuilt? The question was not only architectural, but deeply symbolic. The Twin Towers had represented American power and ambition. Their destruction demanded both remembrance and renewal. After years of debate, the chosen plan combined a memorial with new office towers. At its center would stand One World Trade Center, also known as the Freedom Tower. Rising to 1,776 feet, it would become the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, symbolizing resilience and renewal. Beneath it, the National September 11th Memorial and Museum was created, featuring twin reflecting pools set in the footprints of the original towers. The names of nearly 3,000 victims are inscribed around the pools, ensuring they will never be forgotten. For survivors, first responders, and families of victims, the scars of 9/11 never fully healed. Many first responders developed illnesses linked to toxic dust and smoke inhaled at Ground Zero. Thousands suffered long-term respiratory problems or cancer, leading Congress to pass the Zadraga Act, funding medical care for those affected. For countless others, the trauma was invisible. Survivors and witnesses carried memories of chaos and loss. Many experienced post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, or depression. For families of the victims, anniversaries became days of mourning and remembrance. Each year on September 11th, the nation pauses. Bells toll. Names are read aloud. Blue beams of light rise into the night sky over Manhattan, symbolizing the Twin Towers. The day remains etched into America's collective memory. While the war in Afghanistan continued, the U.S. soon turned its attention elsewhere. In 2003, the Bush administration launched the invasion of Iraq, citing concerns that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed a terrorist threat. Though Iraq had no direct connection to the 9/11 attacks, the invasion was framed as part of the broader war on terror. The initial campaign toppled Hussein's regime quickly, but the aftermath unleashed years of insurgency, sectarian violence, and instability. The war in Iraq became one of the most controversial outcomes of 9/11. Supporters argued it removed a brutal dictator and reshaped the Middle East. Critics said it was a costly diversion from the real fight against al-Qaeda, draining resources and credibility. Meanwhile, the war in Afghanistan dragged on. Despite early successes, the Taliban regrouped. Al-Qaeda adapted, spreading globally. What began as a swift campaign stretched into America's longest war, lasting 2 decades until U.S. withdrawal in 2021. For nearly a decade after September 11th, Osama bin Laden remained at large, a symbol of unfinished business. His ability to evade capture frustrated Americans and emboldened extremists. Finally, on May 2, 2011, a U.S. Navy SEAL team raided a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Bin Laden was killed in the operation. President Barack Obama announced the news late that night, "Justice has been done." For many Americans, it was a moment of closure, though not an end to terrorism. Al-Qaeda weakened, but new groups emerged, including ISIS, which would later carry out its own wave of violence. The legacy of 9/11 is visible in every airport checkpoint, every surveillance program, and every counter-terrorism policy. The Patriot Act and related measures expanded government monitoring of communications and financial systems. Critics argued these changes eroded privacy and civil liberties. Supporters insisted they were necessary to prevent another 9/11. The debate over freedom versus security continues to shape politics today. At the same time, global cooperation against terrorism grew. Intelligence sharing between countries improved. Counterterrorism became a permanent priority of governments worldwide. Beyond policy, 9/11 reshaped culture and society. Films, books, and television grappled with its meaning. Memorials rose not only in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania, but across the world. For many Americans, 9/11 marked the end of a sense of isolation from global conflict. The U.S. was no longer untouchable. Fear of terrorism became woven into daily life, influencing everything from immigration debates to foreign policy. Communities of Muslims and Arab Americans faced new scrutiny, discrimination, and suspicion, despite condemning the attacks. Civil rights groups warned against profiling and prejudice, highlighting the delicate balance between security and inclusion. Today, the world still lives in the shadow of September 11th. The attacks altered global politics, reshaped alliances, and redefined warfare. They fueled debates over freedom, security, and human rights. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq cost trillions of dollars and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The ripple effects continue to influence instability in the Middle East, refugee crises, and U.S. foreign policy. At the same time, the resilience shown in the aftermath of 9/11 remains a source of strength. From the bravery of first responders to the unity displayed in cities and towns across the country, the tragedy revealed both the worst and the best of humanity. September 11, 2001, began like any other day. By its end, nearly 3,000 lives were lost, 2 iconic towers were gone, and the world was forever altered. It was a moment of unimaginable horror, but also one of profound transformation. It redefined America's role in the world, reshaped security, and left a legacy still felt decades later. More than 2 decades on, September 11th is remembered not only as a day of tragedy, but as a turning point in modern history, a day when the world changed course, and when the values of resilience, sacrifice, and remembrance were etched into the fabric of a nation. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to support the channel. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Thumbs up, keep liking and sharing the videos you enjoy, it helps us reach more viewers. Stay tuned, because more inspiring, educational, and engaging content is coming your way. Thank you for being part of our community. Folded hands.